Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Moss. I'm a board member of WASPy, and I have today with me composer Kenley Kristofferson, who actually had two compositions that were finalists in our recent fourth WASPy International Composition Contest. The first piece was in category 1, which is grades 1 and 2, and it's titled Prairie Sunset. And the next piece was category 2, grades 3 and 4, and it is titled Icelandic Folk Song Suite Number 2. Welcome, Kenley.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to just talk a little bit today about you and your background and a little bit about these two compositions. So why don't we start with your background? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a composer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's not a usual start, I suppose. I grew up in a small town on the Canadian prairies called Gimli in the province of Manitoba. It's about an hour north of the province's capital, a city called Winnipeg. And Gimli is a small fishing and tourist town with not a whole lot going on in the winter. The Canadian winter is thriving, alive and well in that neck of the woods. So there was a lot of time to work on our hobbies and our interests. And a few things lined up to set my life kind of on this course, probably about three or four of them. Firstly, I started taking piano lessons, but when I was small and I was not particularly adept. I was average at best, a very generous average. But when I was between 10 and 12, my cousin moved in with our family and she played a bit, but she really played by ear. And watching her play really started informing like the kind of patterns that music moved in. And I
Hmm.
started playing more by ear and started to kind of like feel the patterns that go with key fluency and moving around the keyboard and like that very physical part of playing the piano, like where you're kind of remembering with your hands. Again, like a pretty average piano player, but like starting to see music and the keyboard in a different way. And around that time, or maybe slightly before that, we also got a new computer in our house, which was a big investment in the mid 90s. We had an older computer before with some pretty limited functionality, but there was this kind of technology leasing agreement that went through my dad's work. So we found ourselves with a newer computer, which was super cool for like 10 to 12-year-old me. And though I primarily used it for like writing stories and playing video games, I know not shocking for a 10 to 12-year-old. But this computer came with a piece of software called MIDI-Soft Recording Studio, which
Mm.
enabled me to download MIDI files and then like render them in notation. So it was mostly like music from movies and video games and stuff, but there was something so cool about looking under the hood and like seeing those patterns almost like I was at the keyboard, but it's put into notation. And it was almost like a proto score study, like the very beginning of that. But what was missing in all of this was really genuine music literacy. And that came with high school band. So my school got a new band teacher when I was in about grade 8 or so, and he really ignited this small town music program. His name was Mike Shirlette. He was engaging, funny, like a really good musician. And I started playing trumpet in band and was mostly not very good, mostly because I didn't practice enough. I'm going to own that. But throughout grade 10 and 12, I started getting the scores to our music and then inputting them digitally into MIDI-Soft and kind of going through all the parts like note by note, like really seeing how the piece is put together, who has what moves in into other parts and how that works. And like it really developed this again like score studying literacy of like seeing how the whole thing was put together. And that's like what really interested me. Even though I wasn't again like the world's best trumpet player, I was starting to get a big picture of how this music thing was working. And like couple that with some literacy that's being developed in a high school band, like there was a pocket to put all this stuff in. And the patterns that I was starting to see kind of like before with piano, but like they were larger and more complex about like key centers and orchestration and like these other kinds of things, which is really, really cool. And I suppose the last thing that really cemented this process of getting from there to here was learning how to play guitar. And I was well liked in high school, like not particularly cool as one might imagine, but I spent lots of time like, you know, I had good friends, but I spent lots of time in my room playing guitar and writing stories and composing music. And like by the end of grade 12, I had learned the entire Metallica songbook up to that point, like culminating around the late 90s. But it was the first instrument that I was starting to feel some actual facility and dexterity with. Like I could really get around on it. And when guitar magazines would break apart some Metallica solos, saying, starts in Aeolian, then peppers in Dorian and Phrygian through the B section. Like I was starting to make sense of that with like in my head and my hands. My hands would kind of know what that means. But you can't audition for music school with Metallica. So, so in grade 12, I switched to euphonium from trumpet, and I auditioned for music at the University of Manitoba. And by the good graces of the selection committee, I got into music school, where it was a pretty rough road musically because I was quite behind. I had learned, but I was learning how to do the work, and like that was the real lesson of music school, was like learning how to really buckle down and do something hard over a really long period of time. And like that is also a metaphor for composition, is like the piece doesn't write itself in one day. Like it is a really slow burn. And like kind of this, there's this old Michelangelo quote that I love, of not carving the statue but finding the statue in the stone. And like
Yes.
that's kind of my process of composing, is like, is you're kind of whittling down the extra parts to get to the real seed of what the piece is about. And I learned a lot. Like I didn't take composition in my undergrad, but I spent my whole time writing. And so I taught band for a while, but the writing continued, and I started submitting things for publication, getting some music to the finish line. A lot of things that get submitted don't go into print, real life stuff.
Yeah.
But my first band piece was accepted by Larry Dan, which was wonderful. My second band piece was accepted by him, and then I got some music published at Grand Mesa and some publishers in Canada, and like now we're starting to kind of get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
And I eventually knew, well, I got to the place where I knew what I knew and I didn't know what I didn't know. And it was time to go back to grad school, because now I knew what I wanted to learn. And I finished my master's degree a few years ago with Dr. Pat Carabray at Brandon University, and I'm still teaching band, still writing music, and that's where we are now.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I must say, Kenley, you have probably given many young budding composers out there some hope that there is a alternative path to getting to that proverbial finish line with this
Mm.
being your career. And I would guess there are probably a lot of young musicians out there that could take a similar path as you have just described. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that wonderful story. Let's talk about the two compositions that were in this composition contest. And maybe you could speak a little bit about the inspiration behind them.
Absolutely. So for Prairie Sunset, it was a reimagining of the third movement of my trombone octet called Prairie Trombone Suite, which was premiered by the Manitoba Trombone Collective and guests. So it was something like 60 trombones or something. It was wild. But I thought to myself, like, this last movement's about nightfall, and if I could capture some of the colors in a band setting and maybe change this and that and move this over here, like this piece could really work.
Hmm.
And I think that's where the band version came from, and like it's really quite lovely from a color perspective, and it lends itself a lot to working with kids in that environment, because the music is accessible enough that from a technical perspective the kids can access it. But there's lots of good, more advanced work with color and texture that a younger band can do. Like they are still good little musicians. It's just that a lot of the music from a technical perspective doesn't let them access that. So
Yeah.
it's really important as composers that we are thinking about the big concepts as we write the smaller or younger pieces. Like
And
we always have to have the end in mind.
I'm sure there are many band directors of young performers, players that are so grateful to you for that exact idea. They should have beautiful music and something to really sink their teeth into, whether it be um, easy technically, right, at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Icelandic Folk Song Suite number 2 has a bit of a tale, but I'm really grateful that it's going to print. So in
Huh.
2014, I was on sabbatical for my teaching job, and I had Icelandic Folk Song Suite in my head for a while. So I was going to really lean in, score study like crazy, and like work 8 hours a day writing music, and like write this kind of expansive and technical suite. So suite number 2 is actually movements 3 and 4 from the whole suite,
Okay.
and suite number 1 is movement 1 and 2. So they couldn't be published together. So and part of that is because movements 3 and 4 are quite a lot more technical than the first two. So the whole suite follows like a traditional symphonic form. Movement 1 is an allegro, movement 2 is slower, movement 3 is a scherzo, and movement 4 is a vivace. So it already, like, those last two movements already paint them with a more technical brush. Like it just, the music requires a bit more technicality to access, well, the speed, the color, the character,
Yeah.
and all that. So that was that was something we were working on. But movement 3 is a setting of the Icelandic folk song Krumavísur, which is a strophic setting of a crow scouring the land for garbage and always coming up short. So like the opening oboe and bassoon is like very crow-like and bird-like. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. And then it transitions into the 4th movement, which is a setting of an old folk song called Ausprengisante, which is colloquially known as Rhythm Rhythm, because it was the first 2 songs of the piece. It's about riding a horseback through the mountains and escaping all kinds of peril and magic along the way. So it was a perfect choice of the final movement because it just goes. It's like riding a horse. So the final movement is a culmination really of all the melodic material from all 4 movements. Suite number 1 is published by Grand Mesa in Colorado in the US. And so with suite number 2 going to print, like it's finally complete. The whole thing is finally in print. So I'm so excited about that. I'm like, oh, I just can't even wait.
Fantastic. So somebody could conceivably do the whole suite, all 4 movements together, as long as their players were technically capable of playing 3 and 4, movements 3 and 4, which is suite number 2, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that 1 and 2 don't have the meat. It's just from a technical perspective, a little more accessible.
Sure.
Whereas like 3 and 4, there's a lot of ink on the page.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Understood.
Mhm.
So speaking of which, if a conductor were going to program one of these works, either Prairie Sunset or the Icelandic folk songs, um, what would you say to them? What would be some advice or thoughts you would share?
Yeah. So, sticking with Icelandic folk song suite number 2, I would say that the entire suite should be programmed, like both number
Huh.
1 and number 2 as a 4 movement work, because there's melodic and structural interplay between all 4 movements. It's almost like they're all continually calling back to one another and like referencing one another. So I'd also say like to make sure that the ensemble hears the original folk songs, especially vocal versions of them and especially untranslated ones. Like you really need to hear it in the original Icelandic to hear the rhythm of the text and the color and the feel and how it works in context with the band parts. So that's to me that's really important and something I've talked about with other conductors who have done movement, well, all of them, or but especially movement 4 is don't start it too slow because
Huh.
it's got to go like a rocket. And every time there's one conductor who's kind of been a champion of the work, which I've been super grateful for, Dr. Jackie Dawson at the U of M. And almost every time I've heard it, it keeps getting faster. And it's really exciting. Like the speed and tempo is such an injection of energy into a piece. I know there's a Goldilocks zone, not too fast, not too slow,
Yes.
but the this piece really hinges on almost too fast. Like it's just thrilling. Okay, anyway, with Prairie Sunset, the music moves slow enough and has enough room to breathe. I think that ensembles, and as we talked about before, like particularly younger ones, like can really work with color and letting the music kind of breathe and be slow and like that interpretive detail that sometimes again like you said earlier some young bands don't have the opportunity to practice. So there's a lot of warm dissonance that finds its way into music of older ensembles, but like we were talking about earlier, like these young musicians can do it. Like you just have to teach them. They are capable of wonderful things. Musically it's a level 2, so it might even be like a high 1.5 on a technical level, but like we want these younger musicians to be able to do this and to practice more technical concepts so that when they get to more challenging music, they've already got some tools in their belt. I think
Yes.
that's really important to me.
I love that you're highlighting the concept of tone color with a young ensemble. I think some directors perhaps shy away from that. They're just trying to work on characteristic tone, good solid sounds. But I completely agree with you that even a young band who's working on those concepts, you can start to introduce those ideas of color. And this sounds like a perfect piece for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how about any new projects that you're working on right now? Anything coming down the pike?
Yeah, I've got some band irons in the fire, but the nearest one and one that's pretty exciting is a premiere that's coming up next month with a recording next week. So Dr. Aaron Wilson, who's the trombone and low brass professor at Brandon University, he is recording my new trombone work It's called Arcadia Trombonica, which is set for solo trombone and retro video game ensembles. So like 8-bit
Oh,
Nintendo, Game Boy, Atari, all that. And it's a super cool piece, and we've worked on it like crazy. So we're really excited to share it with the world. The premiere is about a month out, we think, and there's a visual component that will sync up with the performance, which is really exciting. So by mid next year, it won't be ready to premiere, but by mid next year, we'll have like a functional video game that you play alongside the piece that syncs up and acts as kind of a narrative device for the performance of, it's a young adventurer and you go to Dark Castle to retrieve some MacGuffin. In our case, it's the trombone of ages. So it's wild though. Like the piece kind of is meant to evoke like an actual video game narrative, but also the human experience of like playing an old game that you played years ago with all the nostalgia and muscle memory that goes along with it, and kind of live in those two worlds. And we are like really excited to share this. So that's what's coming up in the near future.
that sounds spectacular and something obviously completely new and innovative. So congratulations on pushing those boundaries and doing something really cool and new. So if a conductor wanted to reach out to you and ask you about this new upcoming work or any of your works, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So the most direct one is probably old school email and website. So my website is kenleykristofferson.com, which is quite the mouthful and a lot to spell. But if they look at the video, and I think if I've set this up correctly, they just see my name, then like it's that with no space.com. And my email is my first name, Kenley at my first name, last name.com. Kenley at kenleykristofferson.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Kenley Kristofferson. You can find me on Facebook. I don't think you can find me on X or Twitter anymore, but maybe we'll see each other on Threads or some new
We'll
innovative thing
see.
that they're working on. Yeah.
And
So those are the primary ways to get in touch. Email and website is probably best.
Henley, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about your two pieces, and congratulations on being finalists in the fourth composition contest. Take
Yes.
care.
Thank you so much. You too. Thank you so much for the opportunity.